"My dear Dick," replied the doctor, "had it not been for Joe, you would not be sitting here today, discoursing on the instability of human affairs." "Wholehearted friend," said Kennedy, extending his hand to Joe. "There's no occasion for all that," responded the latter, "but you can take your revenge some time, Mr. Kennedy, always hoping, though, that you may never have occasion to do the same for me." "It's a poor constitution this of ours to succumb to so little," philosophized Dr. Ferguson. "So little water, you mean, doctor," interposed Joe. "That element must be very necessary to life." "Undoubtedly, and persons deprived of food hold out longer than those deprived of water." "I believe it. Besides, when needs must, one can eat anything he comes across, even his fellow creatures, although that must be a kind of food that's pretty hard to digest." "The savages do boggle much about it," said Kennedy. "Yes, but then they are savages, and accustomed to devouring raw meat. It's something that I'd find very disgusting for my part." "It is disgusting enough," said the doctor. "That's a fact, and so much so indeed that nobody believed the narratives of the earliest travellers in Africa, who brought back word that many tribes on that continent subsisted upon raw meat, and people generally refused to credit the statement. It was under such circumstances that a very singular adventure befell James Bruce." "Tell it to us, doctor. We've time enough to hear it," said Joe, stretching himself voluptuously on the cool greensward. "By all means. James Bruce was a Scotchman of Stirlingshire, who, between 1768 and traversed all Abyssinia, as far as Lake Tyana, in search of the sources of the Nile. He afterward returned to England, but did not publish an account of his journeys until his statements were received with extreme incredulity, and such may be the reception accorded to our own. The manners and customs of the Abyssinians seemed so different from those of the English that no one would credit the description of them. Among other details, Bruce had put forward the assertion that the tribes of Eastern Africa fed upon raw flesh, and this set everybody against him. He might say so as much as he pleased. There was no one likely to go and see. One day, in a parlour at Edinburgh, a Scotch gentleman took up the subject in his presence, as it had become the topic of daily pleasantry, and in reference to the eating of raw flesh, said that the thing was neither possible nor true. Bruce made no reply, but went out and returned a few minutes later with a raw steak, seasoned with pepper and salt in the African style. "Sir," said he to the Scotchman, "in doubting my statements you have grossly affronted me. In believing the thing to be impossible, you have been egregiously mistaken, and in proof thereof you will now eat this beefsteak raw, or you will give me instant satisfaction." The Scotchman had a wholesome dread of the brawny traveller, and did eat the steak, although not without a good many wry faces. Thereupon, with the utmost coolness, James Bruce added, "Even admitting, sir, that the thing were untrue, you will, at least, no longer maintain that it is impossible." "Well put in," said Joe, and if the Scotchman found it lie heavy on his stomach, he got no more than he deserved. If on our return to England they dare to doubt what we say about our travels. "Well, Joe, what would you do?" "Why, I'll make the doubters swallow the pieces of the balloon, without either salt or pepper." All burst out laughing at Joe's queer notions, and thus the day slipped by in pleasant chat. With returning strength, hope had revived, and with hope came the courage to do and to dare. The past was obliterated in the presence of the future with providential rapidity. Joe would have been willing to remain forever in this enchanting asylum. It was the realm he had pictured in his dreams. He felt himself at home. His master had to give him his exact location, and it was with the gravest air imaginable that he wrote down on his tablets 15 degrees 43 minutes east longitude and 8 degrees 32 minutes north latitude. Kennedy had but one regret, to wit, that he could not hunt in that miniature forest, because, according to his ideas, there was a slight deficiency of ferocious wild beasts in it. "But, my dear Dick," said the doctor, "haven't you rather a short memory? How about the lion and the lioness?" "Oh, that," he ejaculated with the contempt of a thoroughbred sportsman for game already killed. "But the fact is, that finding them here would lead one to suppose that we can't be far from a more fertile country." "It don't prove much, Dick, for those animals, when goaded by hunger or thirst, will travel long distances, and I think that, tonight, we had better keep a more vigilant lookout and light fires besides." "What, in such heat as this?" said Joe. "Well, if it's necessary we'll have to do it, but I do think it a real pity to burn this pretty grove that has been such a comfort to us." "Oh, above all things, we must take the utmost care not to set it on fire," replied the doctor. so that others in the same strait as ourselves may some day find shelter here in the middle of the desert. I'll be very careful indeed, Doctor, but do you think that this oasis is known? Undoubtedly, it is a halting place for the caravans that frequent the center of Africa, and a visit from one of them might be anything but pleasant to you, Joe. Why, are there any more of those rascally Nyams around here? Certainly, that is the general name of all the neighboring tribes, and under the same climates, the same races are likely to have similar manners and customs. Pa, said Joe, but after all it's natural enough. If savages had the ways of gentlemen, where would be the difference? By George, these fine fellows wouldn't have to be coaxed long to eat the Scotchman's raw steak, nor the Scotchman either into the bargain. With this very sensible observation, Joe began to get ready his firewood for the night, making just as little of it as possible. Fortunately, these precautions were superfluous, and each of the party in his turn dropped off into the soundest slumber. On the next day the weather still showed no sign of change, but kept provokingly and obstinately fair. The balloon remained motionless, without any oscillation to betray a breath of wind. The doctor began to get uneasy again. If their stay in the desert were to be prolonged like this, their provisions would give out. After nearly perishing for want of water, they would at last have to starve to death. But he took fresh courage as he saw the mercury fall considerably in the barometer, and noticed evident signs of an early change in the atmosphere. He therefore resolved to make all his preparations for a start, so as to avail himself of the first opportunity. The feeding tank and the water tank were both completely filled. Then he had to re-establish the equilibrium of the balloon, and Joe was obliged to part with another considerable portion of his precious quartz. With restored health, his ambitious notions had come back to him, and he made more than one wry face before obeying his master. But the latter convinced him that he could not carry so considerable a weight with him through the air, and gave him his choice between the water and the gold. Joe hesitated no longer, but flung out the requisite quantity of his much-prized ore upon the sand. The next people who come this way, he remarked, will be rather surprised to find a fortune in such a place. And suppose some learned traveller should come across these specimens, suggested Kennedy. You may be certain, Dick, that they would take him by surprise, and that he would publish his astonishment in several folios, so that some day we shall hear of a wonderful deposit of gold-bearing quartz in the midst of the African sands. And Joe there will be the cause of it all. This idea of mystifying some learned sage tickled Joe hugely, and made him laugh. During the rest of the day the doctor vainly kept on the watch for a change of weather. The temperature rose, and, had it not been for the shade of the oasis, would have been insupportable. The thermometer marked 149 degrees in the sun, and a veritable rain of fire filled the air. This was the most intense heat that they had yet noted. Joe arranged their bivouac for that evening, as he had done for the previous night, and during the watches kept by the doctor and Kennedy there was no fresh incident. But toward 3 o'clock in the morning, while Joe was on guard, the temperature suddenly fell, the sky became overcast with clouds, and the darkness increased. "Turn out," cried Joe, arousing his companions. "Turn out, here's the wind." "At last," exclaimed the doctor, eyeing the heavens. "But it is a storm, the balloon, let us hasten to the balloon." It was high time for them to reach it. The Victoria was bending to the force of the hurricane, and dragging along the car, the latter grazing the sand. Had any portion of the ballast been accidentally thrown out, the balloon would have been swept away, and all hope of recovering it have been forever lost. But fleet-footed Joe put forth his utmost speed, and checked the car, while the balloon beat upon the sand, at the risk of being torn to pieces. The doctor, followed by Kennedy, leaped in and lit his cylinder, while his companions threw out the superfluous ballast. The travellers took one last look at the trees of the oasis bowing to the force of the hurricane, and soon, catching the wind at 200 feet above the ground, disappeared in the gloom. Chapter 29. Signs of vegetation, the fantastic notion of a French author, a magnificent country, the kingdom of Adamuva, the explorations of Speke and Burton connected with those of Dr. Barth, the Atlantica Mountains, the river Benau, the city of Yola, the Bajal, Mount Mendif. From the moment of their departure, the travellers moved with great velocity. They longed to leave behind them the desert, which had so nearly been fatal to them. About 9:15 in the morning, they caught a glimpse of some signs of vegetation. Herbage floating on that sea of sand, and announcing, as the weeds upon the ocean did to Christopher Columbus, the nearness of the shore, green shoots peeping up timidly between pebbles that were, in their turn, to be the rocks of that vast expanse. Hills, but of trifling height, were seen in wavy lines upon the horizon. Their profile, muffled by the heavy mist, was defined but vaguely. The monotony, however, was beginning to disappear. The doctor hailed with joy the new country thus disclosed, and like a seaman on lookout at the masthead, he was ready to shout aloud. "Land ho, land!" An hour later the continent spread broadly before their gaze, still wild in aspect, but less flat, less denuded, and with a few trees standing out against the grey sky. "We are in a civilized country at last," said the hunter. "Civilized, well, that's one way of speaking, but there are no people to be seen yet." "It will not be long before we see them," said Ferguson, "at our present rate of travel." "Are we still in the Negro country, Doctor?" "Yes, and on our way to the country of the Arabs." "What, real Arabs, sir, with their camels?" "No, not many camels. They are scarce, if not altogether unknown in these regions. We must go a few degrees farther north to see them." "What a pity!" "And why, Joe?" "Because, if the wind fell contrary, they might be of use to us." "How so?" "Well, sir, it's just a notion that's got into my head. We might hitch them to the car and make them tow us along. What do you say to that, Doctor?" Poor Joe, another person had that idea in advance of you. It was used by a very gifted French author, M. Murray, in a romance, it is true. He has his travellers drawn along in a balloon by a team of camels. Then a lion comes up, devours the camels, swallows the tow rope, and hauls the balloon in their stead, and so on through the story. You see that the whole thing is the top flower of fancy, but has nothing in common with our style of locomotion. Joe, a little cut down at learning that his idea had been used already, cudgelled his wits to imagine what animal could have devoured the lion, but he could not guess it, and so quietly went on scanning the appearance of the country. A lake of medium extent stretched away before him, surrounded by an amphitheatre of hills, which yet could not be dignified with the name of mountains. There were winding valleys, numerous and fertile, with their tangled thickets of the most various trees. The African all-tree rose above the mass, with leaves 15 feet in length upon its stalk, the latter studded with sharp thorns. The bombax or silk cotton tree filled the wind as it swept by with the fine down of its seeds. The pungent odours of the pendanus, the kender of the Arabs, perfumed the air up to the height where the Victoria was sailing. The papot tree with its palm-shaped leaves, the sterculia which produces the soudan nut, the baobab and the banana tree completed the luxuriant flora of these intertropical regions. "The country is superb," said the doctor. "Here are some animals," added Joe. "Men are not far away." "Oh, what magnificent elephants!" exclaimed Kennedy. "Is there no way to get a little shooting?" "How could we manage to halt in a current as strong as this? No, Dick, you must taste a little of the torture of Tantalus just now. You shall make up for it afterward." And in truth, there was enough to excite the fancy of a sportsman. Dick's heart fairly leaped in his breast as he grasped the butt of his purdy. The fauna of the region were as striking as its flora. The wild ox revelled in dense herbage that often concealed his whole body. Grey, black, and yellow elephants of the most gigantic size burst headlong, like a living hurricane, through the forests, breaking, rending, tearing down, devastating everything in their path. Upon the woody slopes of the trickled cascades and springs flowing northward. There, too, the hippopotami bathed their huge forms, splashing and snorting as they frolicked in the water, and lamantines, 12 feet long with bodies like seals, stretched themselves along the banks, turning up toward the sun their rounded teats swollen with milk. It was a whole menagerie of rare and curious beasts in a wondrous hot house, where numberless birds with plumage of 1,000 hues gleamed and fluttered in the sunshine. By this prodigality of nature, the doctor recognized the splendid kingdom of Adamuva. We are now beginning to trench upon the realm of modern discovery. I have taken up the lost scent of preceding travellers. It is a happy chance, my friends, for we shall be enabled to link the toils of Captains Burton and speak with the explorations of Dr. Barth. We have left the Englishmen behind us, and now have caught up with the Hamburger. It will not be long, either, before we arrive at the extreme point attained by that daring explorer. "It seems to me that there is a vast extent of country between the two explored routes," remarked Kennedy, "at least, if I am to judge by the distance that we have made." It is easy to determine. Take the map and see what is the longitude of the southern point of Lake Ucayali, reached by Speke. It is near the 37th degree. And the city of Yola, which we shall sight this evening, and to which Barth penetrated, what is its position? It is about in the 12th degree of east longitude. Then there are 25 degrees, or, counting 60 miles to each, about 1,500 miles in all. A nice little walk, said Joe, for people who have to go on foot. It will be accomplished, however. Livingstone and Moffat are pushing on up this line toward the interior. Nyassa, which they have discovered, is not far from Lake Tanganyika, seen by Burton. Ere the close of the century these regions will undoubtedly be explored. But, added the doctor, consulting his compass, I regret that the wind is carrying us so far to the westward. I wanted to get to the north. After 12 hours of progress, the Victoria found herself on the confines of Nigrisha. The first inhabitants of this region, the Chouas Arabs, were feeding their wandering flocks. The immense summits of the Atlantika Mountains seen above the horizon, mountains that no European foot had yet scaled, and whose height is computed to be 10,000 feet. Their western slope determines the flow of all the waters in this region of Africa toward the ocean. They are the mountains of the moon to this part of the continent. At length a real river greeted the gaze of our travellers, and by the enormous ant-hills seen in its vicinity, the doctor recognized the Banao, one of the great tributaries of the Niger, the one which the natives have called the Fountain of the Waters. This river, said the doctor to his companions, will one day be the natural channel of communication with the interior of Nigrisha. Under the command of one of our brave captains, the steamer Pleiad has already ascended as far as the town of Yola. You see that we are not in an unknown country. Numerous slaves were engaged in the labours of the field, cultivating sorgo, a kind of millet which forms the chief basis of their diet, and the most stupid expressions of astonishment ensued as the Victoria sped past like a meteor. That evening the balloon halted about 40 miles from Yola, and ahead of it, but in the distance, rose the two sharp cones of Mount Mendif. The doctor threw out his anchors and made fast to the top of a high tree, but a very violent wind beat upon the balloon with such force as to throw it over on its side, thus rendering the position of the car sometimes extremely dangerous. Ferguson did not close his eyes all night, and he was repeatedly on the point of cutting the anchor rope and scudding away before the gale. At length, however, the storm abated, and the oscillations of the balloon ceased to be alarming. On the morrow the wind was more moderate, but it carried our travellers away from the city of Yola, which, recently rebuilt by the Fuilans, excited Ferguson's curiosity. However, he had to make up his mind to being borne farther to the northward, and even a little to the east. Kennedy proposed to halt in this fine hunting country, and Joe declared that the need of fresh meat was beginning to be felt. But the savage customs of the country, the attitude of the population, and some shots fired at the Victoria, admonished the doctor to continue his journey. They were then crossing a region that was the scene of massacres and burnings, and where warlike conflicts between the barbarian sultans, contending for their power amid the most atrocious carnage, never cease. Numerous and populous villages of long low huts stretched away between broad pasture fields, whose dense herbage was besprinkled with violet-coloured blossoms. The huts, looking like huge beehives, were sheltered behind bristling palisades. The wild hillsides and hollows frequently reminded the beholder of the glens in the Highlands of Scotland, as Kennedy more than once remarked. In spite of all he could do, the doctor bore directly to the northeast, toward Mount Mendif, which was lost in the midst of environing clouds. The lofty summits of these mountains separate the valley of the Niger from the basin of Lake Tchad. Soon afterward was seen the Bajel, with its 18 villages clinging to its flanks like a whole brood of children to their mother's bosom, a magnificent spectacle for the beholder whose gaze commanded and took in the entire picture at one view. Even the ravines were seen to be covered with fields of rice and of arachides. By 3 o'clock the Victoria was directly in front of Mount Mendif. It had been impossible to avoid it. The only thing to be done was to cross it. The doctor, by means of a temperature increased to 180 degrees, gave the balloon a fresh ascensional force of nearly 1,600 pounds, and it went up to an elevation of more than 8,000 feet, the greatest height attained during the journey. The temperature of the atmosphere was so much cooler at that point that the aeronauts had to resort to their blankets and thick coverings. Ferguson was in haste to descend. The covering of the balloon gave indications of bursting, but in the meanwhile he had time to satisfy himself of the volcanic origin of the mountain, whose extinct craters are now but deep abysses. Immense accumulations of bird guano gave the sides of Mount Mendif the appearance of calcareous rocks, and there was enough of the deposit there to manure all the lands in the United Kingdom. At 5 o'clock the Victoria, sheltered from the south winds, went gently gliding along the slopes of the mountain, and stopped in a wide clearing remote from any habitation. The instant it touched the soil, all needful precautions were taken to hold it there firmly, and Kennedy, fowling-piece in hand, sallied out upon the sloping plain. Ere long he returned with half a dozen wild ducks and a kind of snipe, which Joe served up in his best style. The meal was heartily relished, and the night was passed in undisturbed and refreshing slumber. Chapter 30th. Marsfair, the Sheik, Denham, Clapperton and Oudney, Vogel, the capital of Logum, Toul, becalmed above Kernak, the governor and his court, the attack, the incendiary pigeons. On the next day, May 11th, the Victoria resumed her adventurous journey. Her passengers had the same confidence in her that a good seaman has in his ship. In terrific hurricanes, in tropical heats, when making dangerous departures and descents still more dangerous, it had, at all times and in all places, come out safely. It might almost have been said that Ferguson managed it with a wave of the hand, and hence, without knowing in advance where the point of arrival would be, the doctor had no fears concerning the successful issue of his journey. However, in this country of barbarians and fanatics, prudence obliged him to take the strictest precautions. He therefore counselled his companions to have their eyes wide open for everything and at all hours. The wind drifted a little more to the northward, and toward 9 o'clock they sighted the larger city of Marsfair, built upon an eminence which was itself enclosed between two lofty mountains. Its position was impregnable, a narrow road running between a marsh and a thick wood being the only channel of approach to it. At the moment of which we write, a sheik, accompanied by a mounted escort and clad in a garb of brilliant colours, preceded by couriers and trumpeters, who put aside the boughs of the trees as he rode up, was making his grand entry into the place. The doctor lowered the balloon in order to get a better look at this cavalcade of natives, but, as the balloon grew larger to their eyes, they began to show symptoms of intense affright, and at length made off in different directions as fast as their legs and those of their horses could carry them. The sheik alone did not budge an inch. He merely grasped his long musket, cocked it, and proudly waited in silence. The doctor came on to within 150 feet of him, and then, with his roundest and fullest voice, saluted him courteously in the Arabic tongue. But upon hearing these words falling, as it seemed from the sky, the sheik dismounted and prostrated himself in the dust of the highway, where the doctor had to leave him, finding it impossible to divert him from his adoration. Unquestionably, Ferguson remarked, those people take us for supernatural beings. When Europeans came among them for the first time, they were mistaken for creatures of a higher race. When this sheik comes to speak of today's meeting, he will not fail to embellish the circumstance with all the resources of an Arab imagination. You may therefore judge what an account their legends will give of us some day. Not such a desirable thing, after all, said the Scot. In the point of view that affects civilization, it would be better to pass for mere men. That would give these Negro races a superior idea of European power. Very good, my dear Dick, but what can we do about it? You might sit all day explaining the mechanism of a balloon to the savants of this country, and yet they would not comprehend you, but would persist in ascribing it to supernatural aid. Doctor, you spoke of the first time Europeans visited these regions. Who were the visitors? Inquired Joe. My dear fellow, we are now upon the very track of Major Denham. It was at this very city of Marsfair that he was received by the Sultan of Mandara. He had quitted the Bornu country. He accompanied the sheik in an expedition against the Felatas. He assisted in the attack on the city, which, with its arrows alone, bravely resisted the bullets of the Arabs, and put the sheik's troops to flight. All this was but a pretext for murders, raids, and pillage. The major was completely plundered and stripped, and had it not been for his horse, under whose stomach he clung with the skill of an Indian rider, and was borne with a headlong gallop from his barbarous pursuers, he never could have made his way back to Kuka, the capital of Bornu. Who was this Major Denham? A fearless Englishman, who between 1822 and commanded an expedition into the Bornu country, in company with Captain Clapperton and Dr. Oudney. They set out from Tripoli in the month of March, reached Murzouk, the capital of Fez, and following the route which at a later period Dr. Barth was to pursue on his way back to Europe, they arrived on the 16th of February, 1823 at Kuka, near Lake Tchad. Denham made several explorations in Bornu in Mandara and to the eastern shores of the lake. In the meantime, on the 15th of December, 1823, Captain Clapperton and Dr. Oudney had pushed their way through the southern country as far as Sakatu, and Oudney died of fatigue and exhaustion in the town of Murmur. This part of Africa has, therefore, paid a heavy tribute of victims to the cause of science, said Kennedy. Yes, this country is fatal to travellers. We are moving directly toward the kingdom of Baghirmi, which Vogel traversed in 1856, so as to reach the Wadai country where he disappeared. This young man, at the age of 23, had been sent to cooperate with Dr. Barth. They met on the 1st of December, 1854, and thereupon commenced his explorations of the country. He announced, in the last letters received from him, his intention to reconnoitre the kingdom of Wadai, which no European had yet penetrated. It appears that he got as far as Wara, the capital, where, according to some accounts, he was made prisoner, and, according to others, was put to death for having attempted to ascend a sacred mountain in the environs. But we must not too lightly admit the death of travellers, since that does away with the necessity of going in search of them. For instance, how often was the death of Dr. Barth reported, to his own great annoyance? It is, therefore, very possible that Vogel may still be held as a prisoner by the Sultan of Wadai, in the hope of obtaining a good ransom for him. Baron de Niemans was about starting for the Wadai country when he died at Cairo, in 1855, and we now know that de Heuglin has set out on Vogel's track with the expedition sent from Leipzig, so that we shall soon be accurately informed as to the fate of that young and interesting explorer. Marsfaya had disappeared from the horizon long ere this, and the Mandara country was developing to the gaze of our aeronauts its astonishing fertility, with its forests of acacias, its locust trees covered with red flowers, and the herbaceous plants of its fields of cotton and indigo trees. The river Shari, which 80 miles farther on rolled its impetuous waters into Lake Tchad, was quite distinctly seen. The doctor got his companions to trace its course upon the maps drawn by Dr. Barth. You perceive, said he, that the labours of this savant have been conducted with great precision. We are moving directly toward the Logum region, and perhaps toward Kernak, its capital. It was there that poor Toole died at the age of scarcely 22. He was a young Englishman, an ensign in the 80th Regiment, who a few weeks before had joined Major Denham in Africa, and it was not long ere he there met his death. This vast country might well be called the graveyard of European travellers. Some boats 50 feet long were descending the current of the Shari. The Victoria, then 1,000 feet above the soil, hardly attracted the attention of the natives, but the wind, which until then had been blowing with a certain degree of strength, was falling off. Is it possible that we are to be caught in another dead calm? Sighed the doctor. Well, we've no lack of water, nor the desert to fear anyhow, master, said Joe. No, but there are races here still more to be dreaded. Why, said Joe again, there's something like a town. That is Kernak. The last puffs of the breeze are wafting us to it, and if we choose we can take an exact plan of the place. Shall we not go nearer to it? Asked Kennedy. Nothing easier, Dick, we are right over it. Allow me to turn the stopcock of the cylinder and will not be long in descending. Half an hour later the balloon hung motionless about 200 feet from the ground. Here we are, said the doctor, nearer to Kernak than a man would be to London if he were perched in the cupola of St. Paul's, so we can take a survey at our ease. What is that tick-tacking sound that we hear on all sides? Joe looked attentively, and at length discovered that the noise they heard was produced by a number of weavers beating cloth stretched in the open air, on large trunks of trees. The capital of Logum could then be seen in its entire extent, like an unrolled chart. It is really a city with straight rows of houses and quite wide streets. In the midst of a large open space there was a slave market, attended by a great crowd of customers, for the Mandara women, who have extremely small hands and feet, are in excellent request, and can be sold at lucrative rates. At the sight of the Victoria, the scene so often produced occurred again. At first there were outcries, and then followed general stupefaction. Business was abandoned, work was flung aside, and all noise ceased. The aeronauts remained as they were, completely motionless, and lost not a detail of the populous city. They even went down to within 60 feet of the ground. Hereupon the governor of Logum came out from his residence, displaying his green standard and accompanied by his musicians, who blew on hoarse buffalo horns, as though they would split their cheeks or anything else, excepting their own lungs. The crowd at once gathered around him. In the meanwhile, Dr. Ferguson tried to make himself heard, but in vain. This population looked like proud and intelligent people, with their high foreheads, their almost aquiline noses and their curling hair, but the presence of the Victoria troubled them greatly. Horsemen could be seen galloping in all directions, and it soon became evident that the governor's troops were assembling to oppose so extraordinary a foe. Joe wore himself out waving handkerchiefs of every colour and shape to them, but his exertions were all to no purpose. However, the sheik, surrounded by his court, proclaimed silence and pronounced a discourse, of which the doctor could not understand a word. It was Arabic, mixed with Baghirmi. He could make out enough, however, by the universal language of gestures, to be aware that he was receiving a very polite invitation to depart. Indeed, he would have asked for nothing better, but for lack of wind, the thing had become impossible. His non-compliance, therefore, exasperated the governor, whose courtiers and attendants set up a furious howl to enforce immediate obedience on the part of the aerial monster. They were odd-looking fellows, those courtiers, with their 5 or 6 shirts swathed around their bodies. They had enormous stomachs, some of which actually seemed to be artificial. The doctor surprised his companions by informing them that this was the way to pay court to the Sultan. The rotundity of the stomach indicated the ambition of its possessor. These corpulent gentry gesticulated and bawled at the top of their voices, one of them particularly distinguishing himself above the rest, to such an extent indeed that he must have been a prime minister, at least, if the disturbance he made was any criterion of his rank. The common rabble of dusky denizens united their howlings with the uproar of the court, repeating their gesticulations like so many monkeys, and thereby producing a single and instantaneous movement of 10,000 arms at one time. To these means of intimidation, which were presently deemed insufficient, were added others still more formidable. Soldiers armed with bows and arrows were drawn up in line of battle, but by this time the balloon was expanding and rising quietly beyond their reach. Upon this the governor seized a musket and aimed it at the balloon, but Kennedy, who was watching him, shattered the uplifted weapon in the sheik's grasp. At this unexpected blow there was a general rout. Every mother's son of them scampered for his dwelling with the utmost celerity, and stayed there, so that the streets of the town were absolutely deserted for the remainder of that day. Night came and not a breath of wind was stirring. The aeronauts had to make up their minds to remain motionless at the distance of but 300 feet above the ground. Not a fire or light shone in the deep gloom, and around reigned the silence of death. But the doctor only redoubled his vigilance, as this apparent quiet might conceal some snare. And he had reason to be watchful. About midnight the whole city seemed to be in a blaze. Hundreds of streaks of flame crossed each other and shot to and fro in the air like rockets, forming a regular network of fire. "That's really curious," said the doctor, somewhat puzzled to make out what it meant. "By all that's glorious," shouted Kennedy, "it looks as if the fire were ascending and coming up toward us." And sure enough, with an accompaniment of musket shots, yelling and din of every description, the mass of fire was indeed mounting toward the Victoria. Joe got ready to throw out ballast, and Ferguson was not long at guessing the truth. Thousands of pigeons, their tails garnished with combustibles, had been set loose and driven toward the Victoria, and now, in their terror, they were flying high up, zigzagging the atmosphere with lines of fire. Kennedy was preparing to discharge all his batteries into the middle of the ascending multitude, but what could he have done against such a numberless army? The pigeons were already whisking around the car. They were even surrounding the balloon, the sides of which, reflecting their illumination, looked as though enveloped with a network of fire. The doctor dared hesitate no longer, and throwing out a fragment of quartz, he kept himself beyond the reach of these dangerous assailants, and for 2 hours afterward he could see them wandering hither and thither through the darkness of the night, until little by little their light diminished, and they one by one died out. "Now we may sleep in quiet," said the doctor. "Not badly got up for barbarians," mused friend Joe, speaking his thoughts aloud. "Oh, they employ these pigeons frequently, to set fire to the thatch of hostile villages, but this time the village mounted higher than they could go. Why, positively, a balloon need fear no enemies." "Yes, indeed it may," objected Ferguson. "What are they then, doctor?" "They are the careless people in the car. So, my friends, let us have vigilance in all places and at all times." Chapter 31st. Departure in the night time. All three, Kennedy's instincts, precautions, the course of the Shari River, Lake Teachad, the water of the lake, the hippopotamus, one bullet thrown away. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Joe, who was then on watch, at length saw the city move away from beneath his feet. The Victoria was once again in motion, and both the doctor and Kennedy awoke. The former consulted his compass, and saw with satisfaction that the wind was carrying them toward the northeast. "We are in luck," said he. "Everything works in our favor. We shall discover Lake Teachad this very day." "Is it a broad sheet of water?" asked Kennedy. "Somewhat, Dick. At its greatest length and breadth, it measures about 120 miles. It will spice our trip, with a little variety to sail over a spacious sheet of water. After all, though, I don't see that we have much to complain of on that score. Our trip has been very much varied indeed, and moreover we are getting on under the best possible conditions." "Unquestionably so. Excepting those privations on the desert, we have encountered no serious danger. It is not to be denied that our noble balloon has behaved wonderfully well. Today is May 12th, and we started on the 18th of April. That makes 25 days of journeying. In 10 days more we shall have reached our destination." "Where is that?" "I do not know, but what does that signify?" "You are right again, Samuel. Let us entrust to Providence the care of guiding us and of keeping us in good health as we are now. We don't look much as though we had been crossing the most pestilential country in the world. We had an opportunity of getting up in life, and that's what we have done." "Hurrah for trips in the air," cried Joe. "Here we are at the end of 25 days in good condition, well fed and well rested. We've had too much rest, in fact, for my legs begin to feel rusty, and I wouldn't be vexed a bit to stretch them with a run of 30 miles or so." "You can do that, Joe, in the streets of London. But in fine we set out 3 together, like Denham, Clapperton and Overweg, like Bath, Richardson and Vogel, and more fortunate than our predecessors here, we are 3 in number still, but it is most important for us not to separate. If, while one of us was on the ground, the Victoria should have to ascend in order to escape some sudden danger, who knows whether we should ever see each other again. Therefore it is that I say again to Kennedy frankly that I do not like his going off alone to hunt. But still, Samuel, you will permit me to indulge that fancy a little. There is no harm in renewing our stock of provisions. Besides, before our departure, you held out to me the prospect of some superb hunting, and thus far I have done but little in the line of the Andersons and Cummings." "But, my dear Dick, your memory fails you, or your modesty makes you forget your own exploits. It really seems to me that, without mentioning small game, you have already an antelope, an elephant, and 2 lions on your conscience." "But what's all that to an African sportsman who sees all the animals in creation strutting along under the muzzle of his rifle? There, look at that troop of giraffes." "Those giraffes," roared Joe, "why they're not as big as my fist." "Because we are 1,000 feet above them, but close to them you would discover that they are 3 times as tall as you are." "And what do you say to yon herd of gazelles and those ostriches that run with the speed of the wind?" resumed Kennedy. "Those ostriches," remonstrated Joe again, "those are chickens, and the greatest kind of chickens." "Come, doctor, can't we get down nearer to them?" pleaded Kennedy. "We can get closer to them, Dick, but we must not land, and what good will it do you to strike down those poor animals when they can be of no use to you? Now, if the question were to destroy a lion, a tiger, a cat, a hyena, I could understand it, but to deprive an antelope or a gazelle of life, to no other purpose than the gratification of your instincts as a sportsman, seems hardly worth the trouble. But after all, my friend, we are going to keep it about 100 feet only from the soil, and should you see any ferocious wild beast, oblige us by sending a ball through its heart." The Victoria descended gradually, but still keeping at a safe height, for in a barbarous yet very populous country, it was necessary to keep on the watch for unexpected perils. The travellers were then directly following the course of the Shari. The charming banks of this river were hidden beneath the foliage of trees of various dyes. Lianas and climbing plants wound in and out on all sides, and formed the most curious combinations of colour. Crocodiles were seen basking in the broad blaze of the sun, or plunging beneath the waters with the agility of lizards, and in their gambols they sported about among the many green islands that intercept the current of the stream. It was thus, in the midst of rich and verdant landscapes, that our travellers passed over the district of Mafate, and about 9 o'clock in the morning reached the southern shore of Lake Tchad. There it was at last, outstretched before them, that Caspian Sea of Africa, the existence of which was so long consigned to the realms of fable, that interior expanse of water to which only Denham's and Barth's expeditions had been able to force their way. The doctor strove in vain to fix its precise configuration upon paper. It had already changed greatly since 1847. In fact, the chart of Lake Tchad is very difficult to trace with exactitude, for it is surrounded by muddy and almost impassable morasses, in which Barth thought that he was doomed to perish. From year to year these marshes, covered with reeds and papyrus 15 feet high, become the lake itself. Frequently, too, the villages on its shores are half submerged, as was the case with Ngornu in 1856, and now the hippopotamus and the alligator frisk and dive where the dwellings of Bornu once stood. The sun shot his dazzling rays over this placid sheet of water, and toward the north the two elements merged into one and the same horizon. The doctor was desirous of determining the character of the water, which was long believed to be salt. There was no danger in descending close to the lake, and the car was soon skimming its surface like a bird at the distance of only 5 feet. Joe plunged a bottle into the lake and drew it up half-filled. The water was then tasted and found to be but little fit for drinking, with a certain carbonate of soda flavor. While the doctor was jotting down the result of this experiment, the loud report of a gun was heard close beside him. Kennedy had not been able to resist the temptation of firing at a huge hippopotamus. The latter, who had been basking quietly, disappeared at the sound of the explosion, but did not seem to be otherwise incommoded by Kennedy's conical bullet. "You'd have done better if you had harpooned him," said Joe. "But how?" "With one of our anchors. It would have been a hook just big enough for such a rousing beast as that." "Humph," ejaculated Kennedy. "Joe really has an idea this time." "Which I beg of you not to put into execution," interposed the doctor. "The animal would very quickly have dragged us where we could not have done much to help ourselves, and where we have no business to be. Especially now since we've settled the question as to what kind of water there is in Lake Tchad. Is that sort of fish good to eat, Dr. Ferguson?" "That fish, as you call it, Joe, is really a mammiferous animal of the pachydermal species. Its flesh is said to be excellent, and is an article of important trade between the tribes living along the borders of the lake." "Then I'm sorry that Mr. Kennedy's shot didn't do more damage. The animal is vulnerable only in the stomach and between the thighs. Dick's ball hasn't even marked him, but should the ground strike me as favorable, we shall halt at the northern end of the lake, where Kennedy will find himself in the midst of a whole menagerie, and can make up for lost time." "Well," said Joe, "I hope then that Mr. Kennedy will hunt the hippopotamus a little. I'd like to taste the meat of that queer-looking beast. It doesn't look exactly natural to get away into the center of Africa to feed on snipe and partridge, just as if we were in England." Chapter 32. The capital of Bornu, the islands of the Bidyamas, the condors, the doctor's anxieties, his precautions, an attack in midair, the balloon covering torn, the fall, sublime self-sacrifice, the northern coast of the lake. Since its arrival at Lake Tchad, the balloon had struck a current that edged it farther to the westward. A few clouds tempered the heat of the day, and besides, a little air could be felt over this vast expanse of water. But about 1 o'clock, the Victoria, having slanted across this part of the lake, again advanced over the land for a space of 7 or 8 miles. The doctor, who was somewhat vexed at first at this turn of his course, no longer thought of complaining when he caught sight of the city of Kuka, the capital of Bornu. He saw it for a moment, encircled by its walls of white clay, and a few rudely constructed mosques rising clumsily above that conglomeration of houses that look like playing dice, which form most Arab towns. In the courtyards of the private dwellings, and on the public squares, grew palms and caoutchouc trees topped with a dome of foliage more than 100 feet in breadth. Joe called attention to the fact that these immense parasols were in proper accordance with the intense heat of the sun, and made thereon some pious reflections, which it were needless to repeat. Kuka really consists of 2 distinct towns, separated by the Dendel, a large boulevard 300 yards wide, at that hour crowded with horsemen and foot passengers. On one side, the rich quarter stands squarely with its airy and lofty houses, laid out in regular order. On the other is huddled together the poor quarter, a miserable collection of low hovels of a conical shape, in which a poverty-stricken multitude vegetate rather than live, since Cooker is neither a trading nor a commercial city. Kennedy thought it looked something like Edinburgh, were that city extended on a plain with its two distinct boroughs. But our travellers had scarcely the time to catch even this glimpse of it, for, with the fickleness that characterizes the air currents of this region, a contrary wind suddenly swept them some 40 miles over the surface of Lake Teachad. Then were regaled with a new spectacle. They could count the numerous islets of the lake, inhabited by the Bidyamas, a race of bloodthirsty and formidable pirates, who are as greatly feared when neighbours as are the Tuaregs of Sahara. These estimable people were in readiness to receive the Victoria bravely with stones and arrows, but the balloon quickly passed their islands, fluttering over them, from one to the other with butterfly motion, like a gigantic beetle. At this moment Joe, who was scanning the horizon, said to Kennedy, "There, sir, as you are always thinking of good sport, yonder is just the thing for you." "What is it, Joe?" "This time the doctor will not disapprove of your shooting." "But what is it?" "Don't you see that flock of big birds making for us?" "Birds," exclaimed the doctor, snatching his spyglass. "I see them," replied Kennedy. "There are at least a dozen of them." 14 exactly, said Joe. "Heaven grant that they may be of a kind sufficiently noxious for the doctor to let me peg away at them." "I should not object, but I would much rather see those birds at a distance from us."